Good morning and welcome back. One of the main themes of The Big Lebowski was getting a rug that would really tie the room together. When the dude's original rug was lost, they kept on pointing out, dude, that rug really tied the room together. It's important to have things that tie stuff together, be they rooms or units. That's what we're going to be doing today. Today we're going to be looking at the big picture of everything that we've discussed. This is a recap section. If you feel like you've gotten everything that you need to know from this unit, if you feel comfortable for the exam, go ahead and skip this one. That's fine. This is a little extra supplement for those who need it. But I would encourage you to stay anyway. Hopefully, you'll figure out, how do I tie it all together? We began by looking at love and the various kinds of love. One of the things that we observed was that there's more than just one kind of love. We have storge, philia, eros, and agape, each of which they have a family resemblance to one another. To love is to will the good of the other. Each of them wills the good of others in some way, shape, or form. But there is more than one kind of love. Any good vocation is going to teach us how it is that we love more fully in every sense of love. Any vocation is going to teach me more about storge, going to teach me more about philia, more about eros, more about agape. In addition to which, one of the reasons why we took a look at the various kinds of love was so that we could recognize there is more to love than simply romantic love. And this is actually very important. The more that we learn to uncouple our experience of marriage from our experience of any kind of love whatsoever, we learn to sort of lower our expectations a little bit. One of the problems sometimes with marriage is we put way too much pressure on what marriage is supposed to do for us. Marriage is not our only experience of love. It is not our only experience of community, which also means that if somebody doesn't get married, it's okay. There's other ways to experience love. There's other ways to experience the wonderful presence of others. Marriage is a fundamental vocation of human beings and of all mankind. It is a very critical way in which we often learn how to love. But there are other ways that we can receive this love. There are other ways in which we can live this out. And, tellingly, there are other vocations. And this is one of the key reasons why it's so important to remember that there are indeed many kinds of love. Ultimately, with all of these kinds of love, the important thing is to order our love rightly. As St. Augustine reminds us, everybody loves. The question is not what we love. The question is whether we love. And so we have to order our love rightly. And from there, we said that there is an order of creation. If I'm going to love rightly, if my love is going to be rightly ordered, which remember is the fundamental definition of caritas, of charity. Charity is love rightly ordered. Then there is an order that I must conform my love to. And so from here, we began to look at creation. Some of the various lessons that we learned from creation as we looked at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, we saw the goodness of the body and of material world. Remember that in Genesis 1, human beings were created when God first molded us out of the clay and then breathed life into us. We do have a tie to the material world around us. Part of that is essential to our identity. And at the end of each day of creation, God declared, it is good, something that many philosophies were not willing to say. Many philosophies have a very dualistic matter good, bad, spirit good sort of attitude. Christian revelation, Jewish revelation is telling us all of creation and the body and the material world is good and is part of the order that we must be attentive to as we properly and rightly order our various loves. At the same time, Genesis 1 and 2 remind us of the reality of our spiritual dimension. Genesis 1 says that it is God in whose image and likeness we are created. We may have something in common with the rest of the animals and the rest of the plants around us, but we do have a foot in both worlds. So just as God first formed us by creating us out of clay in Genesis 1, after that, we still weren't human yet. He then had to breathe the breath of life into us, his spirit, his ruah. And so we have the clay of the ground and the spirit, the ruah of God. Both of these are an essential element to who we are. Love rightly ordered is going to take into account both our material dimension and our material dimension, both of which are essential to who we are. We also saw the need for personal relationships. It is not good for the man to be alone, as we see in Genesis 2. And so love is going to bring about those personal relationships and is going to give us that unity, which especially has perhaps been lost through sin, through other disorder. Love brings us together. Love is ultimately also, it is a unitive force. This is not an optional extra. We need love and we need to learn how to love. And so vocations, the way in which we learn how to love, any vocation, we have to have some kind of a vocation, some kind of way in which we learn, how is it that I love? From there, we began talking a little bit more in depth about marriage and sexuality. One of the things that we noted is that marriage helps to rightly order human sexuality. With human sexuality, as with all things, the question is, what does it look like in a virtuous context? To do something at the right time, towards the right person, to the right degree, for the right reason. Aristotle says this is virtuous. What about sex? What about sexual relations? Marriage helps us understand and regulate human sexuality so that it does have that virtuous context, and so that sexuality is able to do everything that it is supposed to be about. Marriage is naturally ordered to the good of spouses, and so it is able to channel the unitive dimension of sexuality and towards the raising of children. And so it is able to channel the procreative dimension of human sexuality. Only through marriage are the unitive and procreative dimensions of human sexuality really truly able to flourish. Everything is always about how do we maximize the goods that are supposed to be part of this. Through marriage, sexuality is able to be the wonderful and good thing in the most maximal way possible that God has intended. And from there, with marriage and sexuality, then we have the natural issue of family, because family is what happens when you add marriage and sexuality together. Families are always welcoming towards new life. Children are a blessing from the Lord. Children help us and teach us what it means to love more fully, even if those children are sometimes different than we would have imagined, if they have Down syndrome or some other disability. All children, all new life teaches us and shows us how it is that we can love more fully. Children and new life make us the people we were meant to become. And so families are always welcoming towards new life so that the marriage order of raising new children, the procreative dimension of marriage, is able to fully take place. We saw that families are both social cell and domestic church. Families are the place where we learn how to live in society, and it is a particular expression of the much larger church. Families are where we first learn how to pray, and as communities of faith, hope, and love, families are a legitimate expression of the church in their own right there at home. We saw that government and society has certain obligations towards family. Ultimately, one of the big things we've been hitting, one of the big drums I've been beating this whole unit, families are everyone's business. I have an interest, you have an interest, that guy down the street has an interest. Whether or not you are married, whether or not you have children, families are your business. So in that regard, government and society, there are certain storge obligations. Storge love obliges us to do certain things for families and to create certain conditions in order for families to more easily develop and flourish and be the things which God has made them to be, and to be the things which they are naturally oriented towards. Families are everyone's business. From there, we then began to take a look more at the particularly Christian conception of marriage, and so we took a look at the sacrament of matrimony. Remember that a sacrament is always a visible sign of an invisible reality. In this case, the sacrament of matrimony is a visible sign of the relationship between Christ and the church. Christ the bridegroom, the church the bride. So that the cross is as sometimes referred to as the marriage bed of that matrimony. And the Eucharist, likewise, is seen as the consummation of the relationship, the consummation of the marriage between Christ and church, where discipleship is fruitful. Marriage, the sacrament of matrimony, also provides graces to the couple, what is sometimes referred to as the grace of office, by which we mean the grace, the experience of God's love, which enables us to carry out our duties and carry out our responsibilities. We talked about some of the challenges to entering into the vocation of marriage. We saw the issues with the soulmate model. We saw issues with fear of commitment. We saw issues of constant happiness. What if I'm not ready? All of these issues. And ultimately, one of the things that we observed was vocations form us. Nobody is going to be ready. Don't worry about being happy every minute of every day. Don't worry about if this person is your soulmate. Ask, can this person help me grow in faith, hope, and love? Instead of asking, am I ready? Don't ask that question. Ask, will this sacrament make me ready? Will I then later become the person that I want to be? This is the ultimate question. Our vocations shape who we are. And for that reason, we have to constantly recall the ideal. The ideal is what will shape us. We enter into matrimony. We do not have the ideal yet, but slowly but surely and slowly and surely, we become the ideal. We become the people, the holy individuals that God has called us to be. When Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees, he said, in the beginning, it was not so. Because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed for a bill of divorce, but in the beginning, it was not so. Jesus brings us back beyond the barrier of sin, back to that state of our original innocence, the state of our first parents. This is the question that we always have to be asking ourselves. How were things in the beginning? The cross is all about punching through, knocking over the effects of sin, knocking over the effects of our distancing from God. And so if the cross is all about bringing us over the barrier of sin, back into that state of innocence, to truly live out our vocations are going to be based not on our lives of sin, but on the reality of innocence. Our vocations help us overcome that barrier and become the holy saints that we were meant to be. Your vocation should make you into saints. This is ultimately what we want. And so then the question is, how do we defend this ideal? This is always what we are trying to do. We are trying to defend an ideal. We are trying to say, this is what marriage ought to be. This is what human sexuality ideally ought to be. This is what family life ideally ought to be. Sometimes the ideal isn't possible. But number one, we keep the ideal ever in our minds, and where possible, where we have to, we draw some clear lines and say, the ideal demands that we not permit this. Any no is always for the sake of a much greater yes. And this is important to remember. And so that by embracing this ideal, we embrace our vocations and we embrace the pathway to our becoming saints, the pathway to our becoming the individuals that God has created us to be. This is Unit 3 in a nutshell. This is the basics of the sacrament of matrimony and the vocation to married life and the vocation to family life. It's a truly wonderful vocation, a vocation which I suspect the vast majority of you all are called to. Cherish this vocation. Don't be afraid of it. There will be difficult moments, absolutely. But if you're at home with the mess, and if you have yourself a wife who is able to truly help you to grow and help you to deal with the messiness of life, deal with the unexpected, and engage in that creative fidelity with one another that new challenges and new situations often demand, things will work out. You will become the individuals you are meant to be. You're going to change, and that's fine. If you throw yourselves into your vocation, if you keep God always in sight, trust that that change will be for the better. This concludes Unit 3. But one of the things that we know, of course, is that it's a much larger church, and that the church consists not only of married couples, but also of vowed religious and of priests. And so next time around, we're going to start with Unit 4, talking about priesthood and consecrated life. Have a good day, gentlemen, and be well.